Thanks everyone. Thanks very much to Shule for her excellent moderation of the previous panel. And I'm now very excited to kick off our third panel of the day on the integration of intermittent renewable energy resources. First, let me introduce myself. My name is David Livingston. I'm a Deputy Director for Climate and Advanced Energy in the Global Energy Center of the Atlantic Council. It's a pleasure to be back in Istanbul after having also taken part in the 2018 summit on similar topics that we put together. And it's also a great honor and a great pleasure to be joined by such a distinguished panel today. I know you're all here to listen to them, pick apart the challenges and the opportunities that Turkey is facing in its energy transition. So I'm going to jump right into the discussion with our panel. Let me introduce them briefly, and going from your right and my left. To my immediate left is Pedro Almeida, the head of global business development for EDP Renewables. To his left is Elín Árnadóttir, Nonresident Senior Fellow at the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council, and also a former minister in Iceland who's been intimately involved in economic development and energy system development in Iceland for a number of years. To her left is Kenan Hayfavi, Managing Director at MNG Renewables. Next is Xeniya Rogan, Principal Banker for Eurasia Energy at EBRD. And at the end of the row is Hakan Yıldırım, President of the Turkish Wind Energy Association. As I noted, it's a really great set of perspectives that we have up here on stage. I'm actually going to take the prerogative to start at the very end of the row, though, and just ask Mr. Yıldırım to help explain. There's been quite a bit of mention of the mechanism, the renewable support mechanism that exists here in Turkey. But as a level-setting exercise, perhaps you can explain a little bit more about this YEKA system. What are the different support mechanisms? How have they operated in the past? What are the questions going forward? Just so that we're all on the same page before we dive a little bit deeper into what that means for the grid as we get a higher and higher share of renewables on the grid.
Okay, thank you, David. So first of all, thank you for giving this opportunity. It is a very nice event, and it is a pleasure to be here with you. What I always tell to the audience that wind power doesn't need incentive, but wind power needs solid, predictable, and smart mechanisms. Not only in Turkey, but globally everywhere. As long as there is a mechanism, something can be built up. I would like to address actually 3 questions, because these questions are being asked almost everywhere these days. The first question is YEKDEM, YEKDEM is the name of the mechanism in Turkey, together with YEKA, but since it is ending, YEKDEM is a very famous one, because the new YEKDEM should be declared soon. It is why everyone is trying to understand what is coming. Is YEKDEM an additional cost to the consumers? This is the question, and the answer is no. No, it is not an additional cost. Should YEKDEM price be USD, Euro, or Turkish lira? Definitely not in Turkish lira. And the third question, should local content still be supported under the new YEKDEM mechanism? Shule Hanım, yes, definitely. It has to be supported. And I would like to elaborate these 3 areas, actually. So is YEKDEM an additional cost to the consumers? I'm an engineer, and I cannot keep myself away from thinking in numbers. Therefore, I will do a simple mathematics to explain you if YEKDEM is an additional cost or not an additional cost. In Turkish Wind Energy Association, we have the board members from the banks, and we have the partners also, some of the big banks. And they are conducting some simulations to foresee the future electricity prices so that they can build their business models to the project that they finance. And they studied in their models, and what they have seen that under the assumption that if there was no YEKDEM, no renewable could be generated in Turkey. That was the assumption. And therefore, if there was no YEKDEM, the end price of the consumers would be $1.5 per kilowatt hour higher than today's price. And the Turkish individual consumes approximately 2,800 kilowatt hour annually. Let's make it 3,000 for the simplicity. And $1.5 makes $45 per year. And a family of 4 individuals, let's say, $180 annually. The bill, the electricity bill of a family of 4 individuals, it would be $180 higher than today's price if there was no YEKDEM, which makes 90 Turkish lira per month. That would be the additional cost that we would have paid if there was no YEKDEM. Is there a cost? Yes, because this is the benefit side, but there is a cost reflected to the consumers. When they look at their bills, they see in 2019, $1 per kilowatt hour, which makes $120 additional cost that they are paying, but in the net, it is 30 Turkish lira per month saving that each family, just because we have YEKDEM. Because otherwise, not only from renewables, but from natural gas, coal, the more expensive resources would bring this additional cost. If you look at from the country's perspective, as Deputy Minister Alparslan Bayraktar also mentioned, 300 billion kilowatt hour electricity was consumed annually, and the saving, because I said $1.5 per kilowatt hour is the saving just because we have YEKDEM, the annual saving is $4.5 billion. And the annual cost of YEKDEM to countries is $3 billion. Therefore, when there is a discussion about YEKDEM brings additional costs, because they see on the bill, but they don't see actually what would be the bill if there was no YEKDEM. Therefore, the country, the net advantage is $1.5 billion. And until 2030, this will make $70 billion saving from the consumers. This is what YEKDEM means to the country, to the individuals, and to the families. So the second question, should YEKDEM price be dollar, euro, or Turkish lira? And I said, not definitely Turkish lira. And I'm again looking to this from the engineering perspective by looking at the numbers, by looking at the simulations. Again, the banks are doing this analysis, and what they have seen that if we take a standard project in Turkey, the capacity factor 30%, 35%, let's say 50 megawatt, $5 to $5.5 per kilowatt hour would make this project feasible if you take today's conditions into account, if the feed-in tariff was in dollar. And it was already 6 months ago, we, Turkish Wind Energy Association, announced $5.2 per kilowatt hour as the feed-in tariff. We recommended that price. And if the feed-in tariff, the new feed-in tariff, if it is euro, in terms of euro, just because the interest rate is lower, then 4 to 4.5 euro cent per kilowatt hour would make this project feasible, and the dollar equivalent is 4.5 to $5. So if it was in dollar, 5 to 5.5. If it was in euro, 4.5 to 5. If it is in Turkish lira, then even the indexation of the inflation, etc., all of are done. 6 to 6.5 euro dollar cent per kilowatt hour equivalent of Turkish lira should be the feed-in tariff. Therefore, it actually shows why it should not be in Turkish lira. And it shows us that if it is done in Turkish lira, it brings additional 20 to 30% premium to the projects. So it is an additional cost. And in the meantime, of course, there must be some financial resources which might give us 12 to 15 years loan in Turkish lira. And also, of course, the revenue is in Turkish lira, but capex and opex are mostly in euro or dollar. And in theory, hedging is possible. But look, you get a project after winning an auction, and you execute this project maybe in 3 years. So, which means you can start hedging in 3 years. Therefore, what happens if the currencies change dramatically in these 3 years? You cannot hedge. When we look at the solar tender which was made in 2015, for instance, 600 megawatt was awarded and only 160 megawatt was erected in the last 4 years, which means all the owners of the remaining will be hedging from today. The cost of PV in terms of dollars reduced significantly, but in terms of Turkish lira, the cost increased by 70%, just because of this currency change. If the yekten price was in Turkish lira, none of those projects would have been executed. Therefore, we should also think if we make it in Turkish lira, today it might be okay in the business models, but what happens if the currency changes significantly and you cannot hedge just because you don't start the project immediately? And the third question, it is also very important. Should the local content be supported under the new YEKA mechanism? I will read you some names. These are real names of the real companies. For the blade manufacturing, Enerkon LMTPI. Tower, Alki Ateşçelik Çimtaş Enerkon Gesbey Çiltu Temsan CS Wind. Generator Siemens Gamak Enerkon Ateş Wind. Gearbox Tibet Drinler. Connection elements, the foundation balls, Berdan Norm Kaleliler, and turbine manufacturing, Vestas, Siemens, Gamesa, Enerkon, GE, Nordex. All of them are in Turkey. All of them have invested heavily, and they are employing more than 10,000 people. More than 10,000 people. And they are exporting 70% of their capacity to abroad. And they are here just because we supported them. We supported the local content. So the local content should still continue, but the way how we can support, of course, we can discuss. Because we are supporting the investors who are buying the local equipments. And I can understand some arguments about this, mainly driven by EBRD, but the manufacturers can also be supported. And I think EBRD has no problem about this. So as an answer, mechanism is extremely important. If we cannot build the mechanism with all these instruments in the right way, we can forget about renewables in Turkey.
Excellent. So a useful reminder of the foundation for so much of what we're talking about here. And thank you, Mr. Yıldırım, for setting the table with a lot of good food for thought that I'm sure we're going to now dig into and digest over the course of the remainder of this panel. Let me turn to my left, though, and I'd like to start hearing from actual project developers like EDP Renewables about your portfolio here in Turkey as well as in the broader region, and what are some of the specific grid integration challenges that you're coming up against in some of the markets that you're operating in?
David, thank you. Let me start by thanking the organization, EBRD, Atlantic Council. I think it's fundamental to have these sessions, brainstorm. I think a lot of the countries are facing the same issues. I think in a sense, the countries that are now thinking about these issues can build upon what was the experience of other countries that started before them. And I think we as investors present across the world can also help give this broad perspective. We have alternatives in the way that we allocate our capital, and so there are fundamental topics that for us are important. We are present in 15 countries, a portfolio of around 11 gigawatts across the world, mostly wind, big pipeline of solar as well. So now we always were technology agnostic. I think now we feel that solar is the most competitive technology in a number of regions, and so we want to be able to deploy the most competitive technology in each region. We are so present in 50 countries. I would say we're active in another probably 15. Turkey and Central Asia are a focus of ours. We have looked at the market at several stages of the development. We haven't yet found the right way in. Hopefully now and this discussion and what comes next post-2020 opens some opportunities for investors such as ourselves. I think there are fundamental topics. Yusuf from Masdar mentioned a number of them. I think now in this panel we also heard. I think from our perspective, certainty about what is the remuneration that's going to support the investment that we are making at the beginning of the life of the project is fundamental. And so I'm probably going to repeat the same topics from the last panel, but having a strong mechanism doesn't necessarily need to be rich. It just has to be predictable. So we prefer a tender. We prefer to be in competition to another system that's supposedly very rich and supposedly can attract a lot of megawatts. But if there are fundamental pieces that are missing, talking about currency issues, I'm talking about bankability of the PPAs, even certainty about what's coming, certainty about periodicity of tenders, certainty about how a plan is going to be translated into actionable investments, actionable tenders. All of that plays into our interest in a particular market. And as I mentioned, being international investors, we are able to deploy capital, and we see a lot of different remuneration schemes. And so provided we get that visibility and provided we get visibility on the future, we have everything that we need, and we can then go to the technicalities and build and get the best terms on the capex side, on the financing side, and then be able to break the records. And as Yusuf was mentioned in Uzbekistan, we had a very similar experience very recently in Colombia. First tender of the market, we won about 40% with also a low price in the sub $30 per megawatt hour, or 3 cents per watt. So I think the topic of the panel is how do renewables fit into the broader power sector? And there's a couple of topics that also play a role in our investment, and I would say very fundamental to discuss grid investments. We are generators, and so we will bring these variable power sources into the system. We expect the system to find the right way to accommodate these variable resources in a way that's the most cost efficient for the overall system. There is no doubt in my mind, and I believe in a lot of people in this panel, that renewables are the cheapest source of new power. So if you look at like-for-like investment, if you look at grid parity, if we're looking at beating grid parity, so it's clear that these assets have many advantages to the conventional sources. It's not normal that you find a market where there is no base load, and so you can typically build products, and in some of the markets we are offering fixed shape products with an intermittent resource, because there are mechanisms in the market to be able to find those products. I'm speaking about the US, speaking about other countries in Europe, where you can just shape your product and sell effectively to an off-taker a fixed shape product. There are some markets where that base load comes from hydro, some where it comes from coal, some where it comes from gas. So these are there. We should take advantage of them. I think another topic that is important is cooperation in regions. So I think very interesting the topic of the conference and the fact that we are talking about all these regions, and some of the ministers in the morning were mentioning how important it is that they cooperate, that they find a common model, that IFIs such as EBRD help the countries shape mechanisms that attract investors. Thinking about interconnection, so not looking at our own country, but looking at the regional market and how can we take advantage of excess capacity in one region versus a need for that excess capacity in another. So all of these topics, I think, are pretty much at the top of the table, and the solutions are there. We're not such a young industry anymore. I think we're established as an industry. Now it's time to look at experiences in other countries, looking at the realities of the markets where we are planning on pushing for more renewable penetration, and finding a solution. And the solution, it has to be flexible. I think flexible is the name of the game. We have to be able to work on the supply side, on the demand side. We have to incorporate batteries. We have to understand if it's better to incentivize suppliers to integrate batteries in their own generation, something that we're doing, for instance, in the Californian market, or does it make more sense that it's the system operator that strategically places the batteries and then is able to manage the system as a whole? So all of these topics are being studied. It's clear that the level of renewable penetration that a traditional system can accommodate, it's much more than what we're discussing in this region. So I think we're talking about probably sub 10% penetration. There are already markets working at 20, 30, even 50%. So it's feasible. It's not an issue whether it's feasible, it is. It's just an issue on what is the most cost-effective solution for the system or for the regional systems to be able to integrate this variable resource in a way that can integrate well with the rest of the components of this electrical puzzle and make it the most cost-effective for all the users.
Terrific, thank you. You mentioned baseload and bringing different resources together. Ms. Árnadóttir, I want to turn to you because Iceland is a really interesting case study, a unique one perhaps, but one certainly with lessons for the rest of us, in that you've got in your renewable resource portfolio there, you have intermittent resources, of course, but also some really important baseload resources like hydro, like geothermal. Could you talk a little bit about how Iceland went about a strategy which tried to maximize the benefits of those diverse renewable resources, and also how you built a holistic business model around it so that it was part of a broader economic development strategy rather than just sitting within, let's say, an energy planning silo?
There we go. Thank you, David. And like the others on the panel, I would like to thank the Atlantic Council and the EBRD for inviting me here to this interesting conference. And yes, I come from Iceland, and I have to tell you and tell the audience here that in this group, I'm the privileged kid. We come from a country, I come from a country where 100% of our electricity production is renewable, about 75% hydro, 25% geothermal. Our house heating is 99.9% renewable, 90% from geothermal, and 9.9% from electricity produced by hydro. So we know where those 20, 40 houses are where we're still running diesel or something. They're remote, we're working on it. And I wish that I could tell you that we did this, we had a plan and we just went along, but life is what happens when you're busy planning other things. And what happened in Iceland is we had a good crisis. There was an oil crisis, which affected the whole world in the 70s. And I so much agree with the Deputy Minister this morning when he said that the political will is very important and necessary to make changes. Back in the 70s, during the oil crisis, decision was made in Iceland to switch from imported oil to heat our houses to geothermal. Our local, stable energy source that was waiting to be tapped into, had been tapped into earlier, but not on a nationwide quest. So what was done was that the government came in with a national energy fund that companies could apply for funding for drilling, for a loan, and if the drilling was successful, they paid off the loan. If the drilling was unsuccessful, the loan defaulted on the state. So it mitigated the risk, and I'm of course oversimplifying this story, but the long or the short of it is that within a couple of decades, we have this result that I described here in the beginning, where we are now 100% renewable when it comes to electricity and heating. In our overall energy usage, we still have the transportation and both land, sea, and aviation that we need to work on. And my personal opinion is that we now need, again, to take bold decisions, because the decision at the time to go this way with geothermal, it wasn't easy, it wasn't natural, it wasn't, obvious. It cost a lot of money. It could have gone either way. But now my generation and the generations to come are reaping the benefits. And I think that in all of this discussion that we are having everywhere, discussions such as here, where do we fit renewables into the energy mix, we should reverse it. Where do we have an energy mix that is not filled with renewables? Because we, like quoting the other minister, another minister this morning from North Macedonia, he said, it's not our issue or their issue, it's our common issue, and we need to live up to agreements that we have put forth, the Paris Agreement, and we just need to get on it. Sounding very, very impatient, but I am. So I think that when we're thinking about solutions, we need to be brave, we need to take bold decisions, and we need to be bold enough to leap forward, to be bold enough to try to skip. We don't all have to do the same mistakes. We can, like you said, learn from different countries. For example, if we look at Turkey, there's a lot of geothermal potential, a lot of geothermal utilization. Turkey utilizes more geothermal than Iceland, in terms of megawatts, but there's still a lot of potential. There's some problems with CO2 emissions because of the content of the brine, very geological question. But there we have solutions to other problems elsewhere where that could be used. David, I had the pleasure of welcoming him to Iceland this past year, and I took him to a geothermal plant where they have a technological development called CarbFix, where they are solving CO2 emissions problems by putting it back into the ground from where it came from. That is something that could be brought, technology and know-how that could be brought here. So cooperation, technological knowledge sharing, innovation, and bold decisions. As far as the business model, again, I wish I could tell you that we knew it from the beginning and we had a plan, but it really isn't like that. During our geothermal development, like I said, basically from the 70s till the day today, along the way there have been a lot of problems that needed to be solved, just like I was mentioning, that could be done here in Turkey. One of the problems, for example, was that there was a lot of, when drilling, there was a lot of brine that came up and just flooded all around the plant, and the scientists and the engineers were scratching their heads, wondering, how can we get this to go down again? And there was a local guy who had been reading, he had psoriasis, skin condition. And he knocked on the door of the scientists, and the engineers were all very busy solving the problem, and said, listen, I was reading that the stuff in that brine that you're dealing with is very good for my psoriasis. Can I try and bathe in it? And they said, oh, you are so crazy, just, leave us alone, we're solving a very important problem here. He came back, and finally they got tired of him and said, okay, you can go, you can stay here because this is really hot water. Sign here, enter at your own risk, and leave us alone, we're solving a big problem here. Well, it turns out that he bathed, and for the first time in 20 years, he slept through the night without scratching. And 30 years later, this is one of the wonders of the world, according to the National Geographic. It's the Blue Lagoon that many of you may have visited, and if not, you should. So basically what happened was that the residual from the plant became the resource for the Blue Lagoon. And to make a very long story short, we have 2 power plants in that region, and we have made, or the company that owns the power plants, have created a resource park where its basic ideology, the residual, the waste, we never talk about waste, it's the other value streams from one production becomes the raw material for the other. And that's development, technology, innovation has been used now for decades to solve problems and the circular economy, and that makes business sense. I'm sorry, David, you've heard this before, and I could talk about it for hours, but I will leave it here for now, but it makes economic sense too.
But it's such a compelling story that is worth telling again, and there's always a new aspect to it, which is what makes it so interesting. It's a multi-dimensional strategy by definition. Thank you. Mr. Hayfavi, could you tell us a little bit about your renewables portfolio, and again, in the markets that you're operating in, what are the trends you're seeing in terms of challenges, but also some of the steps that are being taken to lower the total cost of integration, especially as the share of renewables climbs higher and higher?
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you for Atlantic Council and EBRD having such an impressive conference and being a part of it. As MNG, we already invested many dam and hydro in the last decade, and for now on we are very much looking what will come after 2020, so that we will again take a part of in the market. But for now on, we are very much looking forward what will be the supporting mechanism and what will be the investment environment. But in a couple of years ago, we decided to invest abroad, and our focus is Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, East Europe, and Ukraine. In fact, in this region where we already have some businesses, in fact, in the countries where we have already businesses, and we already started to develop an off-grid project in Africa, because as you know, in Africa and in many undeveloped countries, the lack of the grid is the main issue. And having an off-grid system, I think, will be kind of solution in these markets. And we already started to develop a project with a hybrid off-grid project, solar, battery, and which is supported by diesel and not supported, but supported and backed up by diesel generation. And the capacity is around 45 megawatt PV, 120 megawatt hour battery system, and 5 to 10% of the total generation has been supported and backed up by diesel generation. So this is one of the projects that we already started. And on the other side, in these countries, in Ukraine, we started to develop 5 to 50 megawatt solar project in different locations in Ukraine. And as a portfolio for now on, these are all in our hand, but we will extend this off-grid system and duplicate after having one in operation. Beside that, to lower the intermittent resources, integration of the intermittent resources, I think we can have a look in the beginning. So in the beginning, so the variation, the fluctuation of this intermittent renewable sources is obvious. And what did operators do is they allocated some percentage in each substation, 5 to 10%, to keep harmless the effect of this intermittent renewable sources to the grid. So this is the main precautions that they have taken. And it continues like that, but it brings a constraint. Like when we're talking about the renewable capacities, there's a theoretical capacities, there are technical capacities, and considering this constraint, it brings a practical constraints, which includes this connectable capacities. To increase this, what can be done and what can be, first of all, the most important thing is having a power generation mix. This is for sure. But beside that, for an immediate solution, I think batteries can be a solution of this problem, because either distribution companies or transmission companies can allocate some batteries in the substation, which can very easily be able to increase these intermittent sources, the integration of these intermittent sources, and also they will keep the system harmless, frequency controlled, and very much regulating energy can be supplied to the system. And beside that, there is a very famous verse or sentence, I can say, that if you go in internet and search, so there's a plug-in electrical vehicles will balance this intermittent resources. But okay, beside that, again, what I believe that there is a batteries, because the plug-in system will be charged from the batteries, and the existence of the batteries will much more have a positive effect on balancing their variation. Not only their existence, but also the management system is getting much more important here. The battery management system, the load management system is getting more and more important. And also these management system will also include the charging schedule, which also can benefit the low-cost electricity, because the surplus can be benefited from the low cost, and this can also be a very important effect. And beside that, which I believe that in undeveloped countries or developed countries, even in the developed countries, one should think off-grid systems. Because if we can localize the electricity production and consumption, we can minimize the management cost, we can minimize the production cost, and keeping the knowledge of the electricity, using efficient electricity usage to the individuals. Because by knowing this, so we can get the benefit of it, and even quantitative, economically and timely management will bring us the cost-effective solutions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Ms. Rogan, as we've heard throughout today, EBRD is playing an incredibly important role in the region, providing technical policy support, regulatory support, financial support across the board. What are some of the ways that you work with different stakeholders, whether it be government, developers, financial community, et cetera, to anticipate and then to address some of these grid integration challenges? We've heard a lot about what you're doing just to get capacity in these markets, but how do you then also work with stakeholders to think through the integration challenges they're going to have so that you become an important source of counsel, advice, and guidance, throughout the whole life cycle of deploying these renewables?
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Indeed, 4.5 billion euro finance of projects financed last year keeps us busy, but we are still feeling that we are not doing enough. There is so much more that needs to be done. As Nandita pointed out, we should be doing gigawatts, not megawatts. We should be thinking in gigawatts themes, but basically it's clear that there is no perfect recipe that would fit all, no one recipe that would be applicable to every country. This is why we take an approach where most of our countries of operations can be split into 3 groups. The first group would be the early stage renewables market, where we would come in and help the governments to develop the roadmap and to conduct the first stage of project finance projects, and we would finance, help with develop the regulatory framework and finance the pilot projects. The second category of countries would be the hydropower dominated low carbon systems, where we could see that this system could benefit from diversification by introducing solar and wind capacity to diversify and to help with over-reliance on one source. And finally, there are several markets where we see that they are already maturing LNG markets, and here we help and assist with developing markets that are competitive, that can benefit from innovative financing solutions such as green bonds. We provide and manage structures where we can introduce battery storage, and key challenges, of course, to prepare the grid. And a lot has been said today on what we should do. I agree, the key word here is flexibility. We should allow for flexibility for balancing capacity, and successful integration of renewables requires 2 main components. The first one is clearly regulatory, where long-term predictable system is a key, and where we should provide strong balance in demand and response. And the second one is clearly technical, and again, it has to do with flexibility, rollout of innovative solutions, systems, smart meters, remotely controlled substations, and storage solutions. But also good old generation forecasts can be of assistance here. Finally, we've heard today on numerous occasions that cross-border infrastructure can play an important role, and I can only echo that these can facilitate integration. As Kenan just mentioned, we see more and more independent captive PPAs in the system, so I think this might also be the future. And finally, we utilize climate finance architecture to create this butterfly effect in our countries of operations.
Excellent, thank you. And I want to come back on some of those things. But first, Mr. Yıldırım, from a wind energy perspective particularly, how is the wind sector writ large, the wind industry writ large, having to change the way that it engages on some of these grid integration issues as you evolve from becoming a fast-growing alternative energy resource to truly becoming the new normal on the grid, and the new normal in terms of the investment trends that we're going to be seeing year after year after year?
Okay. So as I mentioned at the first part, I'm an engineer and I always look in the numbers. I think in the numbers. And when I look at the numbers of the wind, it was only 10 gigawatt in 2000. When we come to 2010, it becomes 200 gigawatt. Then PV, not only wind, but PV is coming to the stage, and it became 40 gigawatt in 2010. And in 2020, it is the break-even for PV, because PV reach wind. Both are approximately 650 gigawatt globally, but PV is growing very fast. In 2019, in the European Union, 14% of the consumption was generated by wind only. And then when we look at Turkey, it is approximately 7-8%. And for instance, I have a data, 5th of February 2020, the 14%, 7% of Turkish electricity was generated by wind the entire day. And hourly, some certain hours, it reached even 22% from wind. Therefore, the numbers, if you look at the numbers, 50 gigawatt new installations every year from wind, and 120, 150 gigawatt new installations from PV. And when we reach 2050, actually almost half of the electricity demand will be met by wind and PV. Only in wind, $5.3 trillion will be spent by 2050, $5.3 trillion. And for solar, $4.2 trillion. So it is not only climate. Yes, it is climate. Yes, it is green. And it's good for us, for the next generation, but it is also at the same time economy. So who is going to take which portion from this economy? This is one of the biggest questions to be answered. And as in any business, there are first movers and there are followers. In Turkish wind, there were first movers and some of them are here, Erol Bey, Müşfik Bey, so these entrepreneurs could see the things earlier than the others. And there are followers, there are early adopters. And in wind globally, there were the first movers, like Denmark, thanks to the oil crisis in the 70s. And they built the new economy for them. And Turkey is an early adopter, actually. We were not the first mover, but we were early adopters. So we reached 8 gigawatt in wind only by 2020. Today it is 8,065 megawatt. And, but the biggest question, what's next? So is it enough? So 8,000, good, 7% electricity, it was zero only 10 years ago, 15 years ago, almost zero. It is not enough, just because we have done a lot. As I said, I named only 25 companies in the first session, and they are employing more than 10,000 people. They are contributing to Turkish economy significantly. They are doing great export, and $5.3 trillion to be spent more. Therefore, for the countries like Turkey, who is developing, who is reconstructing its economy, wind and PV are the most determinant areas where we need to invest. Of course, together with electric storage, together with digitalization, but when we come back to energy, I think we have done a lot in Turkey, but with the right mechanism, with the right instruments, we can do more. And just because these days it is under heavy discussions about the mechanism, I would like to recommend to decision makers there in Ankara, please involve us. Involve the associations, all associations of renewables and electricity generation associations. We are meeting next week to really raise our voice and to be part of this decision about the mechanism, because it will change the next 20 years of Turkey, whatever they decide.
Great, thank you. Mr. Almeida, since we seem to be in a bit of a, what I'll call, for lack of a better term, a Ask Ankara period of the discussion, let me ask you perhaps a little more subtly, just what are the priority attributes that you look for in a policy environment and in a market environment where you know, okay, I'm going to be very successful and I'm ready to invest a lot of money there for the long term and do a lot of projects there for the long term. Where do you rank things like a really upgraded grid that can handle a lot of different demand and some fluctuations, and maybe handle a lot of electric vehicles coming online. Where do you rank an energy storage policy, an energy storage incentive? Where do you rank flexibility markets or ancillary markets to help support perhaps some of the shaped products that you were describing? Which of these are signal and which of these are noise, in other words, for you sitting in the executive suite?
I think all of the above are important. I think that we have to look at what is the backbone of our investments. I would say the first thing we look at is fundamentals, resource, and the economics of renewables. And Turkey and this region has it all. So I think very low penetration of renewables, a very strong resource, and virtually starting to get developed. And so that is the first thing we look at. Of course, stability of the region, stability of the currency, stability of the countries. But I think there might be mechanisms to work with that. Grid, I would say, is the second. To have a strong policy about supporting, bringing to the network some of these decentralized power plants that are not necessarily how the backbone of the grid was built. And so to have a view of how am I going to promote and bring these pockets of resources and integrating them with the load. Unfortunately, people don't like to live close to where the wind is blowing a lot, and so we have to face this issue in a lot of the countries. And so to have a support for grid expansion, I think it's fundamental. The rest of the topics, I think they become more important as the penetration of the renewables reaches levels where it's starting to make the system operators think about how do I deal with these issues. And so it's clear that in some markets it's going to be more important the issue of batteries. In some others there might be a pumped hydro to work with that. There might be gas that can be activated. It also depends on the economics of the price of gas in the different markets. But I would say all of the above. I don't think for us as investors that are on the supply side, we tend to look too much into how the system is going to handle those. We feel that the solutions are going to be there. And again, going back to the basics, if the support, if we see a clear support mechanism, and we don't need very rich PPAs, what we need is stable PPAs, bankable PPAs. Second, we need a continuity. We cannot be surprised with changes in policy. I mean, that's the worst that can happen if we make a decision to get into a new market. And as we are long-term investors, we want to stay and build generation with the country. So we don't want to make a decision to come into a country or a region based on a promise of a certain periodicity of tenders or a certain stability on the support mechanisms, and then things keep changing, and then I don't know if it's going to be strong currency or local currency, or if there's going to be anything at all, or if we're going to be asked to invest merchant, which we will not. So I think stability is the name of the game, provided we can anticipate what's coming. We can price these assets very competitively.
Excellent, thank you. I want to give an opportunity for the audience to come in. I'm just going to do a quick sweep to see if there are any hands. Otherwise, I've got a couple more questions to ask myself. But feel free to throw your hand up if you do have a question as we go towards the end of this session. Ms. Árnadóttir, I want to ask you, so much of what we talked about today was about regional integration, regional interconnection, and the idea that an enlarged grid is a grid better able to integrate intermittent renewable resources. Iceland, of course, has a different challenge. As a small island nation, what does regional cooperation and regional integration mean for a country like Iceland? How have you thought through that as a nation and as an energy market, where the challenges you have being separated by sea from some of your natural close by economic neighbors and partners? probably necessitates a slightly different approach.
Yes, in the European framework, we are defined as a small, isolated energy system, being an island in the North Atlantic. There have been questions of interconnectors. That project gets explored on average once every decade, let's say. What we have done, we have built up our energy system with large corporations throughout well, since the 70s really, by sort of exporting our clean energy to power-intensive industries. We have aluminum smelters and heavy industry. So our energy production per capita is much higher than the population of 350,000 people counts for. There are sort of two sides to this coin, as most others. We have just gone through, and it's still on the table, a review and an assessment of the feasibility of an interconnector to Scotland. The UK government, or the British government, was very interested. Mind you, this was before Brexit, and a lot of the calculations based on European subsidies, European funding. When I was Minister of Industry, which included energy, we did a huge feasibility study on this, and which I sort of, I commenced the report, but then I put it out for discussion. And I got the report handed in a week before the Brexit vote, so it hasn't been discussed much since then. But there are two opinions. We feel that if you think of it as the global planet, it's our duty to provide free or renewable clean energy and export it to the world. And then there are others who say, well, we want to have the benefits of the renewable clean energy for Iceland and create jobs. So it's an economic question. I thought when you were saying people don't want to live where the wind is blowing. Well, some of us don't have the option of avoiding it. We have started to explore wind energy in Iceland. The reason for we are doing it so late in the game, it's not because there's no wind in Iceland, on the contrary, but because we have been, like I said, the privileged kid in the class. We've had so much renewable energy that we don't have the necessity. But the results of the exploration show that it's very, very good quality wind that we have. So much wind that I will have to stay in Copenhagen an extra night because my flight has been canceled due to a storm.
It's in some ways a good problem to have, in others maybe a frustrating problem to have. Mr. Hayfavi, I want to unpack a little bit more in the markets you're operating in, which are many times, as you noted, slightly less developed energy markets, ones where off-grid solutions might be a first choice. How do you decide, how do you think through what sort of firming or balancing solutions you directly want to be involved in and which you want to leave to other market players? So for example, when you think through energy storage, when you think through backup generators, when you think through demand side management, how do you approach that from a strategic perspective about what you see as very complementary with your business model and what you want to leave to the government or to other market players to take care of?
Well, thank you, David. Okay, so when we decide to have an off-grid system, what is important is first of all to understand the load pattern and adapt the project accordingly, because it can show very much variation. Even if we think about the village and try to supply its energy, that is the household's energy, it's totally different than, for example, a mine which consumes 24 hours a day and 365 days a year, non-stop and constant electricity. So these are two different options. So first of all, we have to understand the load pattern, and afterwards, okay, then it comes the design accordingly, and PV battery system. And for now on, as far as I see, there always have to have a diesel as a backup, because even because it goes beyond or over-designed. It becomes over-designed if you try to omit diesel generation and put it all battery systems. For now on, keeping 5 to 10% diesel generation and backing as a backup and support mechanism, and having a batteries and PV or any renewable sources can be an off-grid mechanism systems.
Excellent. Thank you. Ms. Rogan, as we move towards the end here, I'm actually going to start asking everybody to help set us up for the final panel, which will come after a short coffee break in just a moment, by looking ahead and perhaps laying out for us quite quickly, quite succinctly, just tease us a little bit, because we don't want to take anything away from the next panel, but what are the business models, the technologies, the policy models that that you think are most needed, or that you see are starting to be developed that most excite you? What's next, in other words? How are we going to deal with these challenges once we're not talking about 10, 20, 30%, but instead 50, 60, 70% intermittent renewables on the grid?
Thank you. I guess that's a good question to be asked in Turkey. We were just doing the fortune telling on the coffee yesterday. So maybe I'll ask my colleague to do this coffee app. Apparently they have it here, and do it, because it's really $1 million question, and the idea is to anticipate what's coming. But clearly the world is moving into the green direction. It's clear that storage, once it becomes more affordable, all sorts of storage will be key. In terms of the new regulatory models, again, there will be no recipe that fits all, but I think we'll see a variety of different new innovative solutions for different countries and continents, and hopefully we will actually see the regional and maybe even the world integration among the countries to work towards a better and cleaner and greener future.
Excellent, thank you. A very integrative answer. Mr. Yıldırım, from a wind perspective, what are the things in the industry? You get to sit in boardrooms, visit sites. You're exposed to all sorts of different parts of the wind value chain. Across that value chain, what are the developments that most excite you?
I think the wind technology is developing, which means new innovations are coming, which brings us to the lower cost. So we can expect some further cost reductions, and we can also expect some consolidations also in the global wind industry, because it is all about the scale. And if the manufacturers cannot reach to some certain level, then they either have to come together, or they will be just wiped out. Therefore, it is what I do expect. And there are Chinese players. They are very strong in PV. But for wind as well, there are very big installed capacity in China. As long as they get more experience about international business, I think we will see more Chinese also in the future.
Excellent. Mr. Hayfavi, I want to give you the opportunity as well. Is there anything in either in your business or things you've just been exposed to in the past several months or years of work that most excite you about this sector?
Well, I think all different tools has been integrated into the system, like batteries or plug-in electrical vehicles and so on. Everything's are coming to be should be properly managed. So that is, we already started talking about smart grids, and nowadays a popular word is smart cities, which not only electricity but with other means also, which I believe that the smarter we get, so we will efficiently use the electricity, and everything will be, I think, optimized as far as I see.
Excellent. And Raga, what about you? What most excites you?
I want to look at the broad picture and look into the future. I think that we, as a global community, we need to start prioritizing. I mean, here we have the task at hand. We want to reduce fossil fuels and up renewables. I thought it was interesting when you were talking about what are the things that the investors look at: predictability, continuity, stability, all of those things, which I come from the political sector, is everything but. So these two areas and more need to educate each other and work together in order to be able to, like I started with, to make bold decisions that take us fast into the future. And to secure that we have a future. Not to be gloomy, but that's the common project that we need to work at, and to end on a positive note, I'm very optimistic that that will happen.
Terrific, and fully agreed. And Mr. Almeida, let me give you the final opportunity. What most excites you? What gets you motivated about the next decade ahead for the renewables?
Maybe I'll end on a utopical note. I think, I mean, I'll just start by saying that renewables are intermittent, are variable, but they're not unpredictable. So data is the name of the game, and I think that there's still a lot to get done on the demand side. We tend to look at demand as something static, and I think we will come to realize it's anything but. If you start thinking about trends like EVs, self-driving, if you have a system operator that at some point is able to direct a fleet of vehicles to the areas where they're needed the most, you have a lot of batteries at your disposal. I think looking at batteries as an asset class and really thinking what is the right remuneration mechanism to incentivize the penetration of batteries into electrical systems, I think it's going to make a lot of difference. We tend to think that batteries are more efficient if they're managed by the system operator, because they can be placed and can be sized in a way and can be used for different business models where the data is sitting with the system operator, not with the generators. And so again, going back to the fact that wind and solar are not unpredictable, they can be mixed, so there's hybrid solutions. It just depends on what is the objective of the country, or is the objective of the electrical system. Once we have that figured out, there will be a product that then we can tender, that we can bring to market, and that you will have the private sector supporting with the investment and the expertise, provided there is this stability, continuity, and all those nice things that we like to see as investors. Terrific. So I think I'm excited about the future of the sector, certainly.
Thank you. So we've heard a lot. We've heard about the need for smarter cities, for smarter grids, for a smarter version of politics and political will. When creating these policies, we've heard about the importance of sector coupling and sector intersectionality, particularly as we get electrified transport and things like hydrogen and blue hydrogen and green hydrogen coming out of the grid. There's a lot to be excited about, a lot of tools that we'll need to use in order to ensure that this next 10 years, this next decade to come of renewables integration creates a symphony and not a cacophony on the grids of the 21st century. That's something we're going to be tackling in the final session of the day, which will be addressing the next generation of renewables and the role of innovative technologies. And that will be right here in this room about 20 minutes from now after a short coffee break right outside those doors. Looking forward to seeing you back in here. And thanks very much for joining us. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our accomplished panel. Thank you.